Ernie, I want to talk a little bit about political correctness, which has many dimensions to the kind of concerns that phrase raises. It's become a buzzword, and I'm even reluctant to use it a bit, but it does capture a lot of the intellectual debate going on right now in the United States, and it does raise questions of free speech and the First Amendment. It raises questions about the canon that we should use, the prescribed books that we should learn in our schools, and it also raises the question of what we generally call multiculturalism. So before we begin, Ernie, I want to know if you yourself are politically correct or not. Are you a fit dialogue partner for me on this program?
Well, that's a good question, Jim. Political correctness has some irony attached to it at this point because it's sort of been used as a weapon against other people. I was asked this summer for my definition of political correctness, and I said that political correctness was an unwillingness to make distinctions between excellence and mediocrity. Now, that was semi-tongue-in-cheek, and of course, when it comes to the issue of multiculturalism, my definition would not be intended to hold, but one can't be anywhere near a college or university and not have the idea of political correctness affect them directly or even indirectly.
Well, in the Chronicle of Higher Education, you see articles on it constantly. We have people going around debating this on campuses now, and it's much in the wind, but it is a larger issue than just what happens on our campus, because we in the United States have been a country where people have come from different places. You know, my ancestors came from Germany and Czechoslovakia, and they had to figure out how to make it here in this culture. And so we've had that happen all the way along the line. Now, I suppose one thing that comes into the mix is that there is a group in the United States that didn't come here voluntarily. While my grandfather took great initiative to leave his home in Czechoslovakia and come here to the United States and wanted to come here and saved money and brought his wife over and kids and so on, we have a whole group of people in the United States whose experience is very different from that. And those are our black friends who were brought over as slaves and didn't come here voluntarily and have had to try to figure out how to live in this culture after a whole history of slavery. So it is not, again, a level playing field when you begin to talk about multiculturalism.
Exactly. And of course, then you talk about your predecessors, and then we talk about blacks who didn't come here of their own free will. And it might be nice to remember the original residents here, the Native Americans, who are really sort of shocked by the date 1492 that they were discovered, because, they felt they were here a long time before then, and they had a culture, and they didn't invite the blacks to come here or invite your forebears or mine. They were doing very nicely without us, thank you.
That's right. So there's another group. So we begin to see the complexity of the problem. Here in the United States, we have voluntary immigrants. We have the original indigenous people, the Indians, shunted off to reservations and defeated in many ways, and in great difficulties keeping their culture alive. And we have those who were brought here forcibly. And the problem is, how do we live together in one country? I mean, how do we manage this? You know, in church circles, we see this, like in the Catholic community, we look at ourselves and we say, you know, we, 3/4 of us in the Catholic community were those immigrants who came over and largely made it into the mainstream. You know, the Irish Catholics, the German Catholics, Eastern Europeans, who had this wonderful land of opportunity and who moved up the socioeconomic ladder, started going to college in larger numbers, and now are among the most affluent people in the United States. But at the same time, we got 1/4 of our Catholic community who are the new immigrants, the Asiatics, the Hispanics, who are often on the margins, who haven't made it into the mainstream. And so now we got questions arising about how do they make it. It raises the language question. We have to deal with that. I mean, the other immigrants made it by learning English. So the Germans, the Irish, they kept, or the Germans and the Eastern Europeans, the Italians, Polish people, they kept their traditions in many ways, but they also learned the language English, which became their touchstone or their passageway into the dominant culture. So now we got a multicultural question about the question of Hispanics, and you've got, I suppose, a politically correct view on that question. The politically correct view would be that we should have a bilingual system, I suppose, and that we should respect the Hispanic culture and not force them into the modes of the dominant culture.
Yes, exactly. But then if we carry out the idea of multiculturalism more thoroughly, then we have other dialects and languages which our school kids should be informed of just as well as Spanish or English. It seems to me at some point in time we decided, yes, English, the dominant language, and everybody that comes here after a particular time has to learn English and sacrifice their own native language and their own native culture for the sake of the great melting pot, our culture and our language. I remember a story about FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, talking to the Daughters of the American Revolution back in the early 40s. And at that time, they were a rather snobbish organization who were against just about everything. And he started off his talk by saying, "Good afternoon, fellow immigrants." And I don't think the Daughters of the American Revolution ever forgave him that, though I'm sure it didn't bother President Roosevelt. And it's difficult for us to remember that unless we are Native Americans, we are all immigrants once, twice, 3 times, 5 times, 8 times removed. And what does that mean in terms of how do we act out that memory?
Yes, your wonderful remembrance of FDR is really telling, isn't it? Because, I mean, we've had the dominant culture, and it's been waspish. That's what we kind of, white Anglo-Saxon.
Protestant.
Yes. Kind of, so that as Catholics came to the country, they perceived the country to be of Protestant orientation, to be Calvinistic in its outlook. And that was the sort of the dominant way that the world was seen. And so the Catholics had the problems, how do you fit into all of this? And we had the melting pot symbol, that we would all melt in here. I remember Michael Novak wrote a book called The Rise of the Unmeltable Ethnics. The unmeltable ethnics, so that no matter what the dominant culture was saying, that people retained elements of their ethnicity, their German or Polish background, Italian background, and they didn't really give that up. And I think there's been a next generation that said, that's right, we don't want to give it up. We want to get back to those traditions and hang on to them. So your story, it seems to me, highlights the complexity of the problem. The problem is, how do you have, I would say it, how do you have a genuine pluralism in this country, a pluralism that respects each of the cultures and yet finds a way to live in common, finds a way, a common enough culture that binds us so that we are a given unity, so that we can act with deliberation and we can find common values. We can have what John Courtney Murray called an American public philosophy. We can have a public philosophy that we can latch onto. Now, the people who talk about that, I think, would say, well, where do you get that? Well, we get it in part by the fact that we're shaped by our founding documents, the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment. All of that sort of shapes our feeling of things, that there's freedom, but certain constraints and so on. We also have our democratic values. So we say we ought to be able to come together, discuss, vote on things, work things out, one person, one vote, etc. And we have our long experience as a country, westward movement, our interaction with the native peoples, economic growth, the capitalism that has been part of our whole economic outlook, and so on. I'm just saying, if you're looking for things that might bind us together in the midst of all of these cultures, you might find some of it in that mix that I'm describing there of the founding documents, the democratic ideals, and our experience as a nation.
Oh, I certainly agree, and yet I'm sensitive, as I'm sure you are, to the idea that our founding documents were somewhat after the fact based on who was here before we got here, that perhaps they had founding documents which were significant to them, and we are, somewhat Johnny-come-latelys compared to them. Are our founding documents publicly negotiated on a level playing field, or were they once again the product of dead white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males? And I don't know the question. I think we have another conundrum here in terms of finding answers, but I think we certainly know how to frame the question.
The word that is often used these days is multiculturalism. In some circles, that seemed to be a very positive word. It is a word that recognizes that people come from different backgrounds. We have legitimate cultures. We have a native Indian culture, we have a black culture, Hispanic culture, and that all of those are legitimate and good and have something to say, and they need to be respected, and so on. And that what we need to do is to learn from one another. We need to cross over at times. We have to be sensitive to the nuances of the other culture. We have to be willing to learn that language, learn their modes of thought, so that we can really appreciate them. So we don't, the dominant culture will not just push them down and shove them to the margins, but will actually learn and interact with these cultures. So the word multiculturalism has become a key word in figuring out how to live together in this society in a genuinely pluralistic way.
Agree, and the word multiculturalism is getting played out now in terms of new textbooks and different presentations in schools of our roots, our founding fathers, our founding documents, etc., recognition of the parts that minorities played in our history, and how we were created a more accurate view. Of course, one potential problem with multiculturalism, which isn't terribly well identified, is that it can become a form of moral relativism, that all values held by all cultures represented in the United States are somehow equal values, and that if one comes from a country or a tribe where perhaps the third oldest daughter was sacrificed to the gods, and this is a slight exaggeration, that somehow we should say yes, and that value's okay, because you're okay, and we celebrate diversity. So while we aren't going to sacrifice our third youngest or oldest daughter to the god whatever, we understand your need to do that. Mm-hmm. Where are the bottom line values? Questions once again of religion. How multicultural do we expect Protestantism or Catholicism or the Jewish faith to become? What do the different faiths have to say to this idea of multiculturalism?
Yeah, and the religious element becomes very important in that. I'm back to the kind of quote you used at the beginning about your own sort of humorous quote about what it means to be politically correct. And what was the line again? About it was not to be able to make judgments about
an unwillingness to make a distinction between excellence and mediocrity.
Yeah, right. So I mean that's a way of saying what you're saying here, that you end up in a cultural relativism and a value relativism, where there is no way to adjudicate truth claims and no way to speak about values. that one being better than another or more encompassing than another. Okay. Now, what we know is that there's a whole group of people in the United States who are attacking this sort of multicultural idea. And as I read the literature, they say something like this: well, there's a okay kind of multiculturalism which promotes pluralism, and is sort of as described as I was trying to describe it before and as you were talking about it, that celebrates cultures and learns and promotes dialogue and civil discourse. They'll say, well, that's a multiculturalism that's okay, but most of these people, these opponents, these politically correct people, are into some sort of radical multiculturalism, a doctrinaire multiculturalism, in which what they're saying now is that there is no way to come together, that there's no basis of dialogue, that you need sort of segregation to make it work. It becomes an ethnocentrism, that my group is the only right group and we're the only way to do it, and all I can do is be in an adversarial relationship to other cultural groups. So they're saying that what happens is you end up in the kind of relativism you're talking about through this multicultural approach, and you end up really hurting the nation as a whole, because then you can't find any common ground. You can't find any way to promote dialogue. You can't find anything that all the various groups can hold as a value that will give us a sense of solidarity.
Yes, agree. I think of recently at the University of Toledo, for instance, the attempt to recreate the Black Student Union recently. Now, I remember when I went to UT in the 70s, the Black Student Union was viable and large and had a lot of members, and then apparently it's fallen upon hard times. I would assume the hard times meant there was more integration and there was less need for the Black Student Union, but now the rhetoric seems to be that no, we need to have an alive and well and active Black Student Union so we can hold black values up in the marketplace of competing ideas. So how do we celebrate diversity and hold unity? That's a very difficult tension.
Yeah, it certainly is. And again, we have people like Professor D'Souza, who seems to represent this great attack upon multiculturalism, saying that if you move in that direction, then you really end up with great problems. Again, he focuses on the university and the affirmative action approaches, which his general theory is that if you through affirmative action, we are letting racial minorities come on the campus who aren't prepared to be there, and you have a white backlash, which is saying that places of my white friends have been taken by these minority groups who got lower test scores, and so that this is intensifying the racial tensions that we find on campus. And of course, he's saying that this all goes back to this kind of relativism. I think, some authors take it back to Nietzsche, who, talked about the relativization of values, and Nietzsche, who ended up with sort of a nihilism, not possible to make these truth claims and so on, and also to what we commonly call today the deconstructionists, who insist that in text there is no fixed meaning and that it sort of means whatever the reader says it means. And therefore you're back to kind of concrete situations that we're talking about. It says, well, you've got cultural groups who are saying you can never understand me, and even if you just debate with me, you will set the terms and I will lose. And if I let you set the categories, we will never be able to play on some sort of equal basis. So then you get, as this gets played out, then, and I'm speaking now from Professor D'Souza's position, saying that what we've got now is that every little slight is seen as some horrible offense. Every bit of language that's used that's got some other connotation or can be heard in a wrong way, and then you get people walking around saying afraid to act, afraid to be themselves.
Exactly.
So I'm just setting out the argument that Professor D'Souza uses against the general multicultural position, which is to say there's an okay kind of multiculturalism, but there's also a radical doctrinaire type that is destructive.
Exactly, though once again that can tend to depend on whose ox is being gored. I recall late last year at the university, we had a scholar from the University of Chicago talking about some of your heroes and mine, the ancient Greeks, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Pythagoras, and I think he took the era on up through the time of Aquinas and Augustine. And at the end of his 3-lecture series, a very irate African-American man stood up in the back and said, well, don't you realize that these were all black ideas spinning off of Egypt, and the fact that the black Egyptian culture profoundly affected the ancient Greek culture? And so Socrates and Aristotle and Plato's ideas were black ideas originally. And I must admit that my heart moved within my chest at that moment, because my ox, those values, those icons that I held dear, were being challenged and rather taken away from me. Frightening.
Yes, I've been at conferences where the same sort of thing has happened, and it's been a very difficult dialogue that has ensued. Very, very difficult. I think that often comes under the heading of Afrocentrism and the claim that Egypt was much more influential on Greece than has previously been seen, and so on. My own reading of that debate is I find it hard to give much credence to that and to that particular position.
But of course,
I suppose I would end up being less offended by it than you were. I mean, I simply have not given great credence to that position.
Of course, you and I both have a vested interest in not giving credence to it.
Of course, and that becomes shows the difficulty of the dialogue, doesn't it? And that's what is constantly said by the cultural groups that are on the margins, is that you can't really understand. You don't get it. You don't understand what is really going on here because you have vested interest in it. And I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that all of us have vested interest in particular policy questions or political questions. The proper role of intelligence, it seems to me, is to bring out those assumptions, to try to figure out what the presuppositions are, not to pretend there aren't any, but to see them, bring them into the light of day. And that's what civil discourse ought to do. That's what university life ought to do. But I mean, not just on university campuses, but just generally as we interact as a multicultural society. That we are that. You can't get away from it. And so every citizen of the country has to be somehow sensitive to this kind of question and to figure out what you do about it. I mean, it seems to me that part of what we do is to try to establish what is common. I think we need, the common elements. So what I would like to start with the answer is that we're human beings. And as human beings, we have certain common characteristics that I believe that you can make universal statements about us. That we are beings in the world. We live in this world. We're beings who move towards death. We're beings who are interdependent. We have to interact with one another. We're beings who are shaped by culture. We're beings, from my religious perspective, who are oriented to mystery, who have a drive, a push, an allurement towards what we call the divine. And that I will find that in the heart of all human beings. I must say, in my travels around the world and interactions with different groups of people, I mean, I usually feel I can find that commonness that is underneath all of the other cultural differences, skin color difference, and so on. So part of my bit is, if you're going to work out multiculturalism, you got to start with some sort of common bonding that's unassailable, and I find it in human nature itself, or in human existence itself.
Well, I think the way you were setting the categories is beautiful and all-encompassing and has great potential, as you pointed out earlier. We are talking about problems in setting the categories, and whoever sets the categories essentially sets the playing field. If we have categories of more power versus less power, as I mentioned, teaching composition classes revolving around gender issues and distinctions, male-female distinctions, and with all the stereotypes involved. Once the categories are set as, say, black versus white, yellow versus Hispanic, then we lose that overall category of human being with the characteristics of human beings, which are universal and from which we are able to dialogue with each other.
I don't think there's any doubt about the power relationships that come into play, and I don't think there's any doubt that we've got assumptions that can be off the mark about people who are of different backgrounds and cultures and so on. One of the things that it would seem important is that we here in the United States, just by virtue of living here, end up being shaped by Western culture. In other words, we are the product of a long history that is, you can trace the origins of that back to the Greeks and through the Romans and through the Middle Ages and through the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, through more modern times. But there is a vast fund of knowledge, a wisdom. There are authors and scholars who have shaped that. Now, you can go back and look and say that those people were sexist or were racist and so on. But even when you do that, you end up being shaped by that culture. In other words, to live in the United States is not the same as to grow up in China, where you have characters instead of an alphabet. It is just a very different experience. And so all people who live in this country or grow up in this country get shaped by the culture in which they live. Now, that seems to say that if we're going to live effectively, we have to sort out something about this Western culture. Ernie got just a little time to respond.
Yeah, but it seems to me that culture shaping should not be unidirectional, that we have the potential, the possibility of reshaping the culture also.
Well, I would agree with that, and there's an interaction, a dialogic kind of relationship. Well, earlier we've been talking about political correctness and especially the multicultural dimension. We tried to stake out, I think, two sorts of positions. One is an idea that let's emphasize the common culture, and we got other people who want to emphasize the diverse cultures, and our problem is how to bring those two things together. I want to celebrate a pluralism, that recognizes the differences and say, let's have dialogue, let's talk to one another on the basis of our common humanity.